All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. And I would like to introduce you to Dr. Ted Cross, Clinical Assistant Professor of Leadership and Management and Academic Director for the Master of Applied Leadership and Management program at Thunderbird.
Hello all, welcome to the webinar this morning. We'll probably have a few more people joining as we continue on, and that's just fine. I'd like to welcome everybody to taking time to learn a little bit about our topic today, choice architecture, the science of decision making. If you enjoy these topics, these are the kinds of things we explore in the Master of Applied Leadership and Management degree program here at the Thunderbird School of Business. So I teach a lot about leadership and how leaders can help make better decisions and also how we can influence others to make better decisions. And so we're going to go through some material today that will cover not only some of the assumptions that we make as human beings when we are making decisions, but also how we might influence others when we want them to take certain decision directions. So what I wanted to really start with was some assumptions, and you'll see that my slides are labeled in the top left corner 0, 1, and 2. And 0 slides are really just to get some basic groundwork laid for the understanding of how choices actually work and how the human brain works with making decisions. We will try to finish in about 30 to 40 minutes so we can have some time for questions at the end. We'll go straight through. I'll pause a couple times for some questions along the way. But if you have a question at any time, feel free to use the chat box here on the right-hand side and we will field those. Becca will be helping me if I miss them as they come along. Okay, so first, what is choice architecture and why this title? Really, choice architecture is understanding how people make choices and how to help guide them to make better choices. And the reason I use the word architecture is that we're trying to sort of design choices from the outset. And in order to design choices and decision-making processes, we have to understand some of the underlying principles. Now, one question I often get whenever we start talking about influencing others to make decisions or understanding how we make decisions as human beings is this ethical, Dr. Cross? Should I even know, if I know this information, aren't I going to be manipulating people? Is this something that I shouldn't be doing? Is this sort of like secret mind control? And the answer is it's not mind control. And it is ethical because all of us are being influenced by things that we don't even notice. Now, let me give you an example. Here is a picture of a typical American shopping mall. Now, you'll notice there's escalators and there's signage everywhere, and this is sort of the common area of the mall. And you'll notice there's lots of tiled areas, it's very open, there's lots of things going on. But if you've ever been into one of these types of large shopping malls, you notice that as soon as you walk into one of the stores, let's take Nordstrom for example, which is a large department store here in the States. If you walk into Nordstrom, for example, from the common areas in the mall, you'll notice that it's very quiet. It's very plush. It's a very different environment than what you see here in this picture, which is the common bustling area of the mall. And what you do as a consumer when you enter one of these plush environments like Nordstrom is that your behaviors begin to change and they want to keep you in the store longer so that you'll buy more stuff. So Nordstrom, you'll notice there's a guy playing a piano in there sometimes, or a lady playing a piano in there. There's nice places to sit, and Nordstrom even has a cafe inside, so you never have to leave the actual store. You can stay and continue to shop and shop and shop. Now, shopping malls are designed to be more chaotic in these central areas, in these common areas, so that people will naturally and subconsciously, without even thinking about it, move into the safer areas on the edges, the stores. Human beings are sort of hardwired to seek sort of those refuge places, and what they've done in the shopping mall instance is they've designed it to keep you into those stores and drive you into the stores. Now, the reason I give this shopping mall example is that this is a large building yes, for retail purposes, but it's been designed to influence our decision making and our purchasing behaviors. And so whether or not we think it's ethical to talk about the science of decision making or influencing others based on principles grounded in research, the answer really is that we're all being influenced by things around us without even knowing it. There's a reason why at the grocery store you have to walk past all the other aisles to get to the milk in the back and then return back through all those aisles to go to the checkout counter. That is a strategy to move people towards buying behaviors. So is it ethical? Yes, and I think it's also even more ethical to understand these principles because it helps you as a leader not only be able to influence, but also to think about how you're being influenced. The next thing that we need to sort of get out of the way as an assumption is that we often believe that we all make rational decisions, that we are rational decision-making beings. And what I'm here to say is that we really need to stop thinking about humans and human decision making as rational. We actually make decisions far more often based on emotionality and emotion, and we'll go through some studies here in a minute. But we really need to kind of understand a priori or before the fact that human beings are not as logical as we hope we are. Let me give you a personal example. So here's a picture of two different television sets. The one on the left is the one that I imagined I own in my mind, right? Even though I have a nicer TV than that, that's like what I see. Like, oh, it's an old TV and I need a new one. So when Black Friday came around, that shopping day, and there's a lot of sales, I decided, man, I need to get a new TV. I want one more like on the right. So I did a lot of thinking and I did a lot of internet research. And I went on Consumer Reports. I went online and looked at the different prices for the nice TV on the right or a similar TV to the one on the right. And I also asked people who had recently purchased TVs what they would recommend. And eventually I went out and we bought the new TV and got rid of the old one. Now, when people ask me, why did I buy this new TV? I would respond back by saying, well, it has great features and Consumer Reports rated it as really reliable. It's a great brand and the price I couldn't beat, right? So I listed all these facts, but the real answer was that I just wanted a new TV because I thought it looked cool. It was an emotional decision, and the emotional decision was driving my purchasing behavior, but I had done lots of research to justify my irrational and emotional decision. Now we all do this, right? We all, and there's nothing really wrong with that. It's just recognizing that the decision really was based on an emotional want. And yes, I found rational reasons to back it up, but the real decision was made on emotion. And so we need to recognize that oftentimes many decisions are based on emotion, not rational, sort of logical decision making. Here's an example that I really like to cite, and this is from the legal world, so should be a very logical profession. You know, we're dealing with laws and we're dealing with judges, and in this case, this graph is a study that researchers did on Israeli judges. And these judges were being studied because they were judges over parole hearings. So they were judging folks who were coming up for parole that might be able to come out of prison, and the hearings were to decide if they would be paroled and have time out of prison, or if they would go back into prison. So that was the decision that the judges were making. And so researchers were trying to understand how judges make these parole decisions, and what they found was very interesting. So if you look at this graph, on the left-hand side, you'll see proportion favorable decisions. So a favorable decision is that you're released from prison and you're on parole. And then on the lower part, what you'll see is ordinal position. In other words, which order did you appear before the judge? So you could think about the bottom axis as sort of a timeline. Left-hand side is earlier in the day, right-hand side is later in the day, and then the horizontal axis is your likelihood of actually being granted parole. Now I'm going to let you guys look at that for 1 second and try to think about what you see. And if you see some trends or anything interesting, feel free to type it in the chat box, but just look at that graph for a minute and see what you're starting to interpret. What I notice and what these researchers really notice is that if you showed up in front of the judge, and I'm looking on the left-hand side of the graph here, if you showed up in front of the judge and you were one of the first people in the morning, you had about a 65% likelihood of being granted parole. Then if you were the next person in line, your chances went up even higher to 75%. You see that high spike on the graph. Then you start to see some drop off as the day moves on into the mid-morning, where your odds go down to below 50%, spike back up again, and then continue to precipitously drop all the way down until you can see there's a dotted line where there was just a complete drop and no one was being granted parole. Now that point on this graph is lunchtime. So the closer you appeared in front of the judge to lunch, the least likely you were to be granted parole. Then after lunch, the judge comes back and people are more likely to be granted parole, and then it goes down again until the afternoon break where you see the other dotted line, and then it goes back up again. And then if you're at the end of the day and your hearing's at the end of the day, you're not very likely at all to be granted parole. Now, what's going on here? Is the judge really just consciously making decisions to not grant people parole because the day's going on? No, the answer is that the judge is getting tired. They're experiencing something called decision fatigue. We can only make so many decisions in the day, and we only have so much decision-making power in the day. The second thing is happening is that there's a bias kicking in, and this is called the status quo bias or status quo heuristic. Heuristics are just mental shortcuts that our brains use to make decisions. We use them all the time. Stereotyping is a heuristic. We're using, for good or for bad, putting things into categories when maybe we shouldn't. But in this case, it's a different heuristic that is actually saying, look, let's keep the status quo because it's safer than making the decision against the status quo. In this case, status quo is leaving the person in prison rather than taking a chance and paroling them and letting them out of prison. So the judge is getting tired as they're making decisions throughout the day, and subconsciously they're getting more conservative in their decision making because it's safer to stay with the status quo, leave that person in prison rather than let them kind of out and see what happens, right? So even in the legal profession that's supposed to be completely logical, you have a perfect example here of judges making irrational decisions based on decision fatigue and a bias called status quo bias. Very interesting. One last example of trying to drive home this assumptive point that we as human beings are not really rational decision makers. And if you look at the right-hand picture, that's a picture of a movie popcorn bucket. And there's some researchers that did an experiment recently where they took a bunch of participants in this experiment at a movie theater, a bunch of moviegoers, and they gave some moviegoers a small container of popcorn and the other participants a large container of popcorn. Then the researchers weighed the containers before the moviegoers went to the movie and then sent them to the movie. When they came back, they weighed the popcorn buckets again. And what they found was that those participants that were given a larger popcorn bucket rather than a small popcorn bucket ate more popcorn than the ones who were given the small one. So the large ones, people were eating more. And the researcher said, that's very interesting. Okay, maybe the size of the container matters, but let's rerun this experiment to see if we can try to make it a little bit more fair. So they gave people popcorn in small buckets and large buckets again, but this time they changed the popcorn. They made it a really bad tasting popcorn. So it wasn't going to hurt anybody. It wasn't going to make anyone sick, but it was a bad flavored popcorn, and they flavored it on purpose. And they put the bad tasting popcorn in the small buckets and in the large buckets, gave it to the moviegoers, weighed the buckets before, sent the moviegoers again to the movie, and then weighed the buckets after to see how much people had eaten. And again, what they found is that even when the popcorn was bad tasting popcorn that no one should really want to eat at all, uh, the buckets, the people that had the large containers actually consumed more of that bad tasting popcorn. So just in this case, eating foods and amounts of foods is influenced by the size of the container. And there's an interesting book, if you want to check it out, that's on the left-hand side, called The 9-Inch Diet, that goes over sort of the history of the changing size of dinner plates, and is written by a marketing consultant who discovered through his marketing research that psychologically we will eat more on a larger plate than we would on a smaller plate. So the whole thing is about how to lose weight by eating off of a smaller plate. And actually, this really works. I was telling my class last night that I really love Cherry Garcia ice cream, and I buy those little pints, but the pints are like, I don't know, 750 calories if you eat that whole thing, and I can easily do that. And so I wanted to slow myself down. So I went on Amazon and I bought this tiny little, it's like a baby spoon, I think. It's like a tiny little spoon. And so I have to use that spoon whenever I eat my ice cream because it tricks me into thinking I'm eating lots of bites even though I'm not really eating anymore, but it feels like I am, right? So there's lots of tricks like that. So our brain is often making decisions based on context, and it's making decisions in this case based on the size of a food container because we eat with our eyes, truly. We're sort of looking at it and saying, well, I didn't really eat that much because I didn't put that big of a dent in that huge popcorn container. But the truth is that you've eaten more than the one that was in a small container. So that's another example that we're not too rational in our decision making. It's not always that we're even thinking of it consciously. I'm going to skip this exercise and jump right into some of the tactics because we only have about 20 minutes or so. Now, before I keep going, any questions, people go ahead and type them into the, I see Jim's typing something. Feel free to type some questions if you have them. I'll keep going and I'll try to grab these questions as we go. So we got the assumptions down that humans really aren't that logical in our decision making. It doesn't mean that sometimes we don't use logical sort of processes and thinking, but we need to recognize that many times it's an emotional response that is driving a decision or a behavior, and that's okay as long as we recognize it, and that we can also use that assumption or that knowledge to go ahead and influence others. And the first tactic I want to talk about, and this is why number one, is to paint a vivid picture. Now, Jim has a comment. He says, you can learn more about the previous discussion by reading Nudge. Yep, Nudge is a great book. Or Thinking Fast and Slow, that's by Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel award-winning behavioral economist. And I'll have some books actually at the end. So the first principle is paint a picture. If you want to convince someone of something, one of the best research-backed ways to convince them is to paint a vivid picture of the choices that you're presenting to someone. We truly do believe what we can see, that old adage, and there's some interesting examples we can move through about painting a picture for folks. So there was a study a number of years ago at the University of Bordeaux, and this was a study of trained wine tasters, so people who have been trained formally to taste and describe different types of wine. And the researchers decided to play a trick on these wine tasters and set up an experiment. And what they did is that they took white wine and they put red food coloring in it. And they put red food coloring into the white wine, and then they gave it to these professionally trained wine taste testers. And then they asked these wine taste testers to actually describe the wine and taste it and all those things. And what they found is that the wine taste testers described the white wine with red food coloring in it as red wines. Now, these are people who are trained for lots and lots of hours and are professionally recognized in their field for being able to distinguish very slight differences. But when the researchers put red food coloring in white wine, they described it as red. And so the title of the study was uh, the mind tastes what the eye sees. And kind of the idea here is that even though these people were highly trained, they were fooled by their perceptions because they assumed automatically, because the wine was red, that it was a red wine rather than a white wine with red food coloring in it. So here's another example that painting a picture is very important because it can override some of our other senses, and it can also often hijack our brains into thinking one way or the other. Now, one of the reasons for that is because a lot of our brain power is tied up in these two things right here, in our eyes. Uh, Actually, physically, we only can see with our eyes about the diameter of a nickel or a little coin. We only see that much physically, but our brain fills in the rest. It's extrapolating, it's using lots of other information to fill in. And so it takes a lot of brain power. And so if we can sort of use that sense to help convince people and elicit an emotional response, we're more likely to nudge them into that direction. Here's another example. This was a study that was done at a college campus, and the researchers set up tables where they were kind of giving away free coffee, and they took the same coffee and they put some of the coffee in sort of a regular looking throwaway cup like the one on the right hand side of the screen. And then they took the same coffee and put it into a branded cup like the one on the left. And they gave out these different coffees. And even though it was the same substance, it was in different packaging. And then they asked the students in surveys which coffee tastes better. And of course, what happened is that the students reported that the branded coffee tasted better than the one in the non-branded cup, which is very interesting because it's the same exact coffee. But that the branded cup actually sort of persuaded people that it was a better tasting coffee, right? And we all know this, and it's not just that we believe it's better tasting coffee. They're actually doing neuroscience experiments now where they're doing brain imaging, and they're noticing that people actually experience the coffee as tasting better in different types of packaging or in different contexts or settings than in others. So yes, the substance is the same, but the experience can be very different, and it also often persuades people. So there's something here about setting a context, painting a picture through context, or brand cues if you like, to be able to convince people one way or the other. One more example from the legal field. And the reason I use the legal field is because it's supposed to be so logical and it's supposed to be so cut and dry, but it never really is. And this was a large study that was done. They set up mock trials. So these were fake trials, and they had all these juries come in that were made up of participants in the experiment. So regular people that agreed to participate in the mock trial experiment came in. They were the juries. And in the trial situations, they were testing one thing. In various different conditions or different trial runs of these mock trials, they would have a person who would be giving testimony, and I think the trial was about a car accident. And so this person would come in and testify to the jury about what they saw at the car accident. And in one condition, the person giving the testimony would give very pallid testimony. In other words, very uninteresting, low detail sort of testimony. And then in the next run of it, they would bring a different jury in and they would have the same person testify about what they saw in the car accident, and they would give lots of details about what they saw, and they would paint a very vivid picture of what they had seen at the scene of the accident. So in one condition, the jury saw a very sort of boring description of the car accident, and in the second condition, the jury saw that very vivid and detail-laden description. And what they found every time, even when they switched the person giving the testimony from the defense side to the prosecution, or from the prosecution to the defense, whoever had that person giving vivid testimony would win the case. So if the prosecution had that person giving the vivid testimony, they won. If the defense had that person giving vivid testimony, they won. And they also noticed that when the person was giving the pallid testimony, they didn't win the case, right? And so the pallid, or the uninteresting sort of description of the car accident. So what these researchers concluded, and they repeated this experiment over and over again, is that even if you can't paint a picture physically by showing a brand image like we talked about with the Starbucks cup, or painting a physical picture by using a different color of wine or an advertisement or some sort of graphic, you can paint a picture using words. And so even in this case, the testimony of someone talking about a car accident, if they used sort of descriptive words and told a story, they were able to be more convincing and convince the jury to their explanation and their side of things. One last example about painting a picture. This is the famous Coke versus Pepsi taste tests. Now, this was from, I think, the late 80s. And they're running these ads. Pepsi was winning all these blind taste tests, and Coke was getting very worried. And so some 20 years later, there's a researcher at Baylor, at the Baylor Neuroscience Imaging Lab, that decided to find out what's really going on. Because if you look at Pepsi and you look at Coke molecularly, so the substance, they're pretty similar. There's slight differences, but they're very similar. So why would people have such strong sort of preferences for Coke or for Pepsi? And you all know people who love one or the other and won't drink one or the other. And so the researchers wanted to find out about that. So what they did is, rather than just doing a blind taste test experiment where people would try Pepsi and Coke in a blind condition and tell which one they liked best, they put them in an fMRI machine. And this is a machine that looks at where the blood in your brain is going, so they can kind of see which parts of your brain are being used in different instances. So they put these participants in the fMRI machine, and then in a blind condition, and what they had was, actually there was a little tube that came in to the fMRI machine and transported a tiny taste of either Coke or Pepsi to the participant in the fMRI machine. And so they would give the participant a taste of either Coke or Pepsi in the blind condition, so they didn't know if it was Coke, they didn't know if it was Pepsi. And then they would ask the participant to rate, which one they liked better, Coke or Pepsi, even though they didn't know which one it was. It was really like, did you like number one or did you like number two? And what they found was that in the blind condition, about half of the people liked Pepsi and about half of the people liked Coke. And when they looked at the brain scans later, what they found was that the more rational decision-making part of the brain was lit up. The blood flow was going to there. So in the blind condition, the researchers were hypothesizing that people were making a more sort of empirical decision. They were using their senses to sort of decide which one they liked better in a blind condition. And they repeated the experiment, but this time they showed people a picture of the Coke logo or a picture of the Pepsi logo before they received the taste. So the person would be in the fMRI machine. They had this little tube coming in, and they would be able to either see a Coke image and then taste Coke, or see a Pepsi image and then taste Pepsi. Now, they ran a bunch of other variations, but what they found in this second type of condition is that in the presence of what the researchers call brand cues, or these sort of logos, uh, people overwhelmingly preferred Coca-Cola. Now, the researchers were very interested in this. Okay, in the blind condition, half liked one and half liked the other, but now in the presence of this pictures of the brand, everyone's saying overwhelmingly they like Coke. So they looked at the brain imaging, and what they found was that in the second condition, where people saw the brand images, the amygdala, or the emotional part of the brain, was lighting up and was driving decision-making processes. So a different part of the brain was actually being utilized, the emotional part of the brain, and people were choosing Coke in the presence of these images. Now, if you don't believe me that people can't really tell the difference in a blind condition, try it at a party sometime. I did it once, did a blind taste test between Coke and Pepsi, and every one of my diehard Coke or Pepsi fans could not actually tell the difference. But what the point of this story is, and this study is really that people are using different parts of their brain, in fact, in the presence of a vivid picture or painting a picture. So painting these pictures really can influence the way people make decisions. Okay, we're on to our last part. We have about 8 minutes left. Any questions before I continue on? And thanks for everyone. I see people have been joining, so thank you. The second tactic really is about limiting choices for people. Less but better. It's not less is more, it's less but better. Remember we talked about the judge at the beginning, and the judge was experiencing decision fatigue because as the day went on, they had to make more and more decisions. They only had so much decision-making power. Now that happens to all of us. In fact, there's this really interesting, I think it was a New York Times article that talked about President Barack Obama when he was in office. He only wore blue or black suits. And they said, well, why do you only wear blue or black suits? And he said, well, because it's one less thing I have to decide every day. It's a uniform, right? I just pick a suit and I save the rest of my decision-making power for more important things. And he's trying to conserve that way. Now, this happens to all of us. We get tired, and if there's too many choices, the research says people are less likely to make a choice, number one, and two, they're less likely to be satisfied with it. So there's a great book called The Paradox of Choice by a psychologist, Barry Schwartz, and there's a great TED Talk too called The Paradox of Choice. It's kind of old, but you could check it out. And this psychologist really was talking about how it is a paradox sometimes when there's more choices that we're less satisfied. And he tells a story about going to a large clothing retailer called The Gap, where there's lots and lots of different styles of jeans sold. And so here's a picture of lots of different types of jeans. You got straight leg cut, you have original, you have different colors, you have slim straight, you have all these different price points too. And so Dr. Schwartz talks about going into one of these places and spending an hour or more picking out a pair of jeans for himself. And he said he bought a pair of jeans and he walked out of that store, and he said he had the best fitting pair of jeans he had ever purchased because there were so many great choices. But he said that as he walked away, he was unsatisfied with his purchase. Now the question is, why would he be unsatisfied with his purchase when he had the best fitting pair of jeans that he had ever bought in his life? So Professor Schwartz goes on to discuss this and says, look, he was unsatisfied because as he was walking away from the store, he knew somewhere in the back of his mind that there might be a better fitting pair of jeans somewhere back in all those stacks, right? There might have been a better choice he could have made. Now, this happens a lot of times when there's lots and lots of choices. Researchers have run lots of experiments that show in the presence of too many choices, people get paralyzed, and they also sort of feel like, man, maybe I didn't make a good choice and I should have made a better choice. And so less is better. Sometimes we need to limit down the number of choices we're putting in front of people to help nudge them into a positive direction. Perfect example is another experiment. If you look on the left-hand side of the screen, this is a bunch of jellies or jams, spreads, preserves, depending on where you're from. And these researchers from Columbia went to a large supermarket and a grocery store, and they put out two tables. And on one table, they put lots and lots of these jams, maybe 20 or more jams. And then on another table, they put less, only like 5 jams. And they set up these two tables so that people could come do taste tests, so they could sample a little bit of the different types of jams that were available. And at the table with lots and lots of jams, there was many more taste testers than at the table with just a few jams. So the large table with lots of choices of jams had lots of taste testers, more taste testers than the limited choices at the small table. But then the researchers continued to follow the taste testers, and what they found was the table with less choices, with the least amount of jams, had more purchases at the cash register. So even though the large table with lots and lots of jams had more taste testers, the table that had less choices had more purchases. And so again, this is going back to this idea that in the face of many choices, and in this instance, the taste testers were tasting all different types of jams because there might be a better one in this large choice set where there's lots of jams. But at the small table with less choices, they're only tasting a few, and then they're making a purchase. Now, you may have noticed this before if you have ever gone into a store to try to buy cologne or perfume. You know, you start smelling these different colognes or different perfumes, and after about 3 or 4, you can't hardly tell the difference and know which ones you like anymore. Now, sometimes they have like a little cup of coffee beans that you can smell to try to clear your palate in between. But have you ever noticed that the more perfumes or colognes that you smell, the more confused that you get? Now, if there was only a few of them put in front of you, you'd probably be more likely to make an actual purchasing decision. So on the right, you'll see Trader Joe's, which is a grocery chain here on the West Coast in the US. And their store has something like, I don't know, I think it's 60% less or 50% less products than a typical grocery store. And it's actually physically smaller. And the whole point of that is to allow people to actually make more purchasing decisions and only carry things that people buy often. And they also often only carry the house brand, the Trader Joe's brand, and 1 or 2 others. So there's very limited things to compare against. Now, before I continue on, I will say that these two principles, that people are more likely to make a choice with a limited choice set and are more likely to be satisfied with that choice, has also been bared out in places like the investment world. So they looked at retirement plans, for example, like 401ks. That's a retirement plan where you can pick a mutual fund inside of it. And when they gave people lots and lots of choices of different types of funds they could invest in, different choices, people were less likely to actually make a decision because they were wondering if they would make the wrong one and they needed more time to think about it and they would just quit. And what they found was that people who were given less choices, even in the 401k situation, were more likely to make a decision and start investing. Another way to limit choices is to actually put forward a sort of manufactured choice set. And so create a point of reference for people to make decisions, because we all make decisions based off the available point of reference. So whatever point of reference we have, or using it as a comparison point to make decisions and sort of modify our behaviors. So Apple, when they first came out with the iPad, there were other tablets, but there weren't a lot of tablets like the iPad. And so Apple decided to do something sort of ingenious. They created 3 versions of the same iPad, but one had the least memory, and the largest, most expensive one had more memory. And I think if you remember, the lowest cost one only had, I think, Wi-Fi, and the middle one had Wi-Fi and more memory, and then the third one had like cell phone, 3G network at that time capability, and a little bit more memory even. And so Apple was actually setting up a point of reference because one didn't really exist. They were really trying to sell you a lot of the middle priced iPad, but they needed to have these other two options for consumers to make a decision against. So we could look at the cheap one and we could look at the expensive one, and we could decide then on sort of the middle priced one, and that's where they made most of their sales. So if you create a point of reference and you create a decision set, you can often help people move into one decision or another by limiting choices. This is sort of the old sort of adage of asking your kids if they want to eat the peas or the carrots first. Do you want the peas or the carrots? You're not saying, do you want peas, carrots, or a donut? You're saying, do you want peas or carrots? And if we set those decision sets up in the right way, where often we can nudge people in the right direction for actually making better decisions. Now I'm getting to the end of my time here, but what I wanted to also mention, in addition to these three things we've just gone over. So we've gone over one, the assumption that we need to throw away is that human beings are rational decision makers, which we are not. We often make decisions based on emotion. Then I gave you two tactics to try to influence others. The first is to paint a vivid picture of whatever you're trying to sell, whatever you're trying to present, whatever you're trying to lead people towards as a leader. And second, limit the choices, less but better, so give less choices. And the third thing I want to mention here is just a smorgasbord of other things that you'll want to keep in mind as you're trying to persuade people or set up choice sets and decision-making contexts. First is social proof, and that's a term from sociology, and really what it says is that when we see other people doing stuff, we're more likely to do it. So this is why advertisers use spokespeople. This is why companies will give away services to a certain number of customers at the beginning, is because if we see that other people are doing something, we're more likely to adopt that something also. And the second piece of that is that it also fosters a sense of community, that we belong to something if there's a group there, and kicks in what I like to call social shaming, which is we're less likely to stop doing a behavior if we are involved in a community or social setting. This is why CrossFit, Orange Theory, and all these things work really well to keep people going to exercise regimens, and that's because it's a community-based or a group-based mentality. The other thing you want to keep in mind is likability. So whatever you're presenting, whatever you're trying to lead to, if you're not likable, it's less likely that you will actually be persuasive. There's lots of research on that. The third thing is remember the tactic of chunking. So break off complex things into small pieces. So don't try to get someone to invest in the 401k to begin with, or choose the mutual funds to begin with. Maybe the first step is just getting them to enroll, or actually enrolling them and asking them to opt out is a better way to do it. So break complicated decisions into small parts. And then the last one I like to call seeding habits. And this is the idea of capitalizing on habits and behaviors that people already have, rather than trying to change their behaviors. So let me give you an example. I'm not real great at managing my money, and I wanted to get better at managing my money, and I never was checking my budgets. And so I had a different habit that I was good at, and that was I'm very good at tracking my calories and what I eat. And I have a little app that I put all of my calories into. I've done it for years. It's second nature. It's very easy for me. And so what I did was, on my phone, I put the budget app right next to the calorie counting app. And so every time I went to habitually go to my calorie counting app, I would see the money app. And I still see it there, my budget app, right next to my calorie counting app. And then I started to be more likely to actually push on that app, look at my money, and start managing it better. And it really changed one habit into two habits for me, and it really has worked easily. So you can do that. If you can find habits that people already have, go with their inertia. I call it psychological jujitsu. Use their current sort of momentum in their habits to do a new habit. Here's some books, and we'll send out the recording of this that cover some of these topics if you'd like to read more on it. Nudge was mentioned by Jim, and Predictably Irrational is Dan Arley. He's another behavioral economist. The Paradox of Choice we talked about with Barry Schwartz. And also Jonah Berger has written a book called Contagious and a new one on social influence that I'm only halfway through. He's a Wharton professor who talks a lot about decision making. Another book from Jim, Why We Buy, is a good one. There's also another one called Biology, Buyology, and that's a great one too. I'll go back to that, don't worry. If you're interested in these kinds of topics, we encourage you to apply to the Online Master of Applied Leadership and Management, which I'm the director, and check out our landing page. It's a 30 credit program. It's in a flexible online format. We cover leadership and management from an international global perspective, especially looking at leadership and management through the lens of high growth and emerging markets. It can be completed in a year or a year and a half, depending on how fast you want to go. It's taught by all of our Thunderbird professors here. I teach the personal leadership and development class, which is about how do you manage yourself to become a leader, to lead others. We cover all the basic business topics in our courses, all through the lens of leadership. So I'd like to thank you all for coming out to our webinar today. We are going to send out the link to the recording later, and I'm going to be here for another 15 minutes or so, or 10 minutes or so, to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Cross, and thank you everyone for joining us. While you're typing in your questions, I'd like to invite you to join our next webinar. We hold these once a month, and the next one is on positive psychology, the science of happiness, on February 15th at the same time. And you can check out all of our webinars here at this link.